everyone, it's language learning is like a blessing and a curse, as they say. They want to say, oh, well, it's a blessing in the fact that you get to be more small, you get to learn a different language, you get to interact with people from around the world, but a curse meaning that, okay, why do you have to learn all this? You're living in one location, kind of like that feeling, right?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it just depends on what you do and what bubble you're in. These days, I think the amount of times people bump into other languages has increased a lot. So one really interesting thing is like my mom I'm from a very small town, Northern California. Like there's not that many people that are international from there. Like I grew up around mostly people that look like me, right?
Yeah.
My mom works a very local job and went home for the holidays and I see her watching a Korean drama. Because Netflix has all these international shows now. It's like,
okay, she watched Squid Games. She watched Squid Games as her first.
Yes, Squid Games. But then she got into that and it recommended her, I think, like Crash Landing
on You.
I think that's the name.
Oh yeah, that was one of those romance types.
Yeah, and then she's really into romance shows and she started getting into these Korean drama, like romance shows, and she had never been interested. I lived in China. She'd never watched a Chinese TV show in her life, Now I catch watching Korean dramas.
I mean, it would be tough to even watch a Chinese TV show back in the day.
That's true. Although these days there's definitely a lot. Although, yeah, not as much Chinese media around. But there's the cultural interest just from your own self, maybe. Like, hey, I'm interested in, in the past it was more personal. Well, now you kind of can't avoid it anymore. So I don't know if there's any necessarily local places that don't have some kind of interaction multiculturally anymore.
I mean, nowadays the world is becoming multicultural. Like everywhere you go, every city you go to now has multiple different languages spoken. And yeah, especially the cities you go. I mean, maybe not the countries, maybe not rural areas, but mostly the cities. They're very multilingual. You get the opportunity to at least maybe listen to a lot of these different languages all at the same time. Like New York is basically home to 180 plus languages. But yeah,
I think isn't New York more than 50% of the people there, their native language is not English. And I think LA is pretty close to that as well.
Oh yeah. But also, when we spoke earlier before we started recording, you said you speak Chinese and Japanese, right? Do you speak other languages besides that?
I would not say I do. So my bar for saying that I speak a language is pretty high. So Mandarin, Chinese, speak it at a very high level. And I would say my Japanese is fluent. I can take business meetings here and there, but it's not native level fluency.
How do you define native level versus just regular conversational level?
This is a great question. And it's very, very often up for debates, especially in the polyglot communities, right? How do you call a polyglot? There's these people on YouTube who they say that they speak 17 languages or whatever, and they kind of maybe they rehearse a script or something like this. But what is the definition? There's no official definition. There's frameworks for understanding what your level is. I have my own personal definition. So I think there's basic conversation fluency where you can talk to somebody about really basic topics about yourself and the world around you. You can kind of get around, but not deep topics. So you can definitely not do business. And so if you get up to business level fluency, you could talk about, maybe you could do a deal in the language, but it's not native level fluency. Native level fluency is where you could joke in the language.
Yeah.
With 4 people in a room out for drinks, and you could, everyone's talking to each other back and forth crossfire, and you can follow along in kind of this kind of situation. That's native level fluency.
Yeah, you literally have to live in the country. Let's say if you were to do this in Japanese, you have to live in Japan for 5 years to be able to even do that.
Yeah. So there are people who have done it without living in the country, and there's definitely ways, but generally it's around 5 to 7 years. So for Chinese, it took me about 5 years to get to that level. 7 years where I didn't even recognize it, maybe in a 6-month period, I won't even find a situation where I was uncomfortable. But 5 years till you get to that point where you're really comfortable living in the country. Yeah, that's a good guess.
Yeah. So right now you're trying to build, let's just say this app you're building. We can discuss more about that later, but this is more meant for a different approach to language learning in a way, right?
Yeah. So, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, and finally last year decided to try to build something like this. The idea is that most apps out there now, they're these contrived experiences kind of boiled down into trying to make it a math problem, language a math problem. But language isn't that simple. And so when you go out and try to use what you learn in the classroom in real life or listen, you realize, oh, this is way, way, way different. So you have to disconnect between the learning materials and what in classroom environment and real life environment. And then there's this giant gap between them. And it's kind of just up to you to make the leap. And that's where a lot of people get stuck. So what we're trying to do is flip it on its head. Start with the end goal instead of having people get there later, right?
Right. I was just gonna say, if it were, let's say, I've learned French and Spanish in school, and they've taught me in a very formal way of speaking. But then when I went to Mexico and Spain, or even France, they started using a lot of slang where somewhat I couldn't understand what the heck they were saying. I thought I knew what I was speaking, and I had to literally. It's like, for them, they use slang, but I have to use textbook way of talking in French and Spanish to be able to, at least keep the conversation going.
Right, like you're intelligible to them, but they're not intelligible to you. Like they can understand what you're saying, but it's really hard for you to understand what they're saying.
You know why is that?
That gap is huge. Yeah.
Why is that? Like, let's say even for English, let's say we're native English speakers, but let's say for someone who speaks a different language, but he's speaking English, but they're speaking English as like a second or third language, and they are not they're conversational level like how you are with Japanese or Chinese. So what is that? So how do you know? The question was like, why is it that we kind of understand them, but they don't understand us?
Well, that's because we've broken it down into these. We're trying like classrooms, and they have to. They break it down into what is the easiest teachable piece of this. Like, I am going to the store, and they usually teach it to you in that way. But when somebody talks in English, they say, I'm gonna go to the store. I'm gonna go to the like this is just one example that a lot of my foreign friends have trouble with, is that when people speak in English, we don't speak like this. So one of it's a listening comprehension problem, right? Two is a vocabulary difference. Is the vocabulary used in real life very often is a different vocabulary set that is taught in the classroom. And this is very common in Japanese as well. There's this test called the JLPT, which is a formal test of your level. People have passed the JLPT 1, which is the highest level possible, but can barely hold a conversation in real life. Why? The types of things that they learned were not useful at all. No one says those things, right? Vocabulary is not.
Yeah, because I'm someone who never even took any language exams in Chinese or Japanese, but I still could hold like a basic level conversation. That's an interesting factor.
Yeah, so if you picked it up in natural situations or from people, like, hey, what does that mean? And you hear people talking. The people who do this end up with a much higher conversational ability, like real life usage ability. I'll give you a really cool story. So I studied abroad in China, and this was a long time ago.
We were just gonna delve into like your background, like what made you become a language learning guy, and also your like overall startup life or like your business ventures.
Okay. Yeah. So, I mean, I guess it kind of ties in kind of the same story, is that, come from a small town, always dreamt about getting out and traveling the world, right? I think a lot of people like that if you're from a small town. So my traveling the world happened to be China. So went to China, freaking loved it. And one thing I noticed while I was there is that I started off as one of the lowest level Chinese speakers when I got there. It was a year-long program. At the end of the year-long program, I was by far the highest level speaker. And I was wondering, why did this happen? And it was just the methodology that I had used, which is just immersion. I talked to people, walked around with a dictionary. I've held on to that like methodology for a very, very long time, although I didn't reapply it to Japanese until a few years ago. But why I was so interested in culture and language, because I moved to China, learned Chinese, and then I ended up staying there, and I lived there for 10 years. And so language and culture and that difference was always in my face. Like, I'm not from here, and I'm speaking another language, and then I've got my foreign friends who are from all over the world, and I've got my Chinese friends. It was just always a daily thing, right? So it's in the forefront of your life, and it's a problem that a lot of people around you have. Like, hey, how did you learn Chinese? I'm asked all the time. How should I learn English? Asked all the time. And so I had to over time kind of
you were bad
with my methodology.
Like when you went to China, there were no smartphones back then. Everyone just had to use their books to really understand to really read what's going on over television. But
yeah, so I had a paper dictionary, and so looking up words in Chinese is not as simple. You can't just look up the word. You have to look up you
got to look at the tone.
Grammatical.
Got to look at the tone. You got to say, you cannot just, there's a character that means one, there are 4 different tones for Mandarin, right?
Yeah.
and if it's pronounced one way or the other, let's say there, that means it's just, if it's like there, if it's pronounced one way, that means a different word versus another word.
Yeah, example is ma means mother, but ma means horse.
Yeah.
And so it gets so like tonal language, and but like looking up things in the dictionary, because it's like pictorial, right? You have to read this like it's like the radical, which is one piece of the character, and there's only like a certain number of those, and you look up from there and then count the strokes, like how many strokes to write this character, and then you flip through the dictionary and count. Anyway, it was a long like process.
I presume when you met with a shopkeeper and they were asking what do you want, you just asked, order this, like, oh, I don't know, I don't understand in China, I don't understand what you're saying. What thing with on?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you can say like take it, which is like really common things, like this. But if you listen, they'll say the name of the thing, and then you can repeat back and use this like shadowing technique to like remember like names of objects. So it's like really common way of doing it. But yeah, like learning back then, there was no smartphones, so like I ended up going through 2 different paper dictionaries in a year, like because they just got so worn out of like flipping through the pages. But like now with smartphones, things are a lot easier. Definitely way easier. People use flashcards, like in like real life flashcards, like you had paper in your room, and I remember my friend had this crazy stacks of flashcards. But like now you've just got your smartphone for it, so it's a lot more efficient.
Cool. And so now you've also you worked on 3 or 4 different ventures before you started Umi, right?
Yeah. So I've been trying to do startups for a long time. And as anyone that does startups knows, it's a crazy life adventure, and it's very, very hard. It really forces you. And now that we're talking about languages and Chinese, there's, it's like basically means that entrepreneurship is the path to enlightenment. Because it forces you to really question yourself and the world and values and anyway, just so many things. So yeah, I was in the gaming space before this, and my last venture was an app called Quick Match, which was like social app meets gaming app. We had some success, but so far I haven't had like a large monetary exit yet, but I've had a lot of informational exits. Learned a lot.
And so now what you're building right now with Umi, so what is the overall layout as to why you're building Umi?
Yeah, so running into this problem for so much of my life, and actually I'm very, very passionate about language learning. I'm very, very passionate about cultural exploration and travel, and I want to learn more languages. And I realized if I don't build a better app for learning languages, I'm going to keep going through the same pain that I've had to go through, learning Chinese and learning Japanese, and I don't want to do that. And I explored every app out there, and I realized they're all still using these kind of outdated ways of approaching language learning. Joined some hardcore polyglot communities that, use it's called input hypothesis, this immersion-based method. There's like 20 different tools you have to set up, and there's like all these manual processes of, okay, first like install these 3 extensions and then save it here, then format it this way, and then import it into the system to properly run like a smart language learning process. That was based off of real life exposure to the language. Because at the end of the day, our brain is a super processor. It can pattern recognize, and so you're trying to get as much real life input into your brain as possible, right? And there's no other system set up. There's no other app that does this that's really based on real life input. So like your brain can really start to pattern recognize and understand the language. And so like for Japanese, I try to watch TV shows as much as I can. Got fluent through just watching TV shows mostly, but it's not super effective because of an idea called comprehensible input. It's not comprehensible enough. So very, very painful still. So I wanted to build a comprehensible, digestible approach to real life situations. So really, the answer to the question is I wanted to build it for me because I want to learn more languages in the future and I don't want it to be painful anymore. But at the same time, other people have the same problem, and hopefully, we can get people to usable level of language in a faster time and have it be more rewarding along the way,
And so what is it that you're seeing? So right now, what you're trying to do is build a very comprehensive app where, it makes language learning a lot more easier and more engaging rather than just, have a bunch of stuff there for you, like how Duolingo does it, right?
I'd say the main difference between our approach versus Duolingo's approach is Duolingo's like the robot. It's kind of, it doesn't have a soul. The sentences don't mean anything. They're not people speaking them. They're not from real life experience. No matter what you learn there, there's still that question is this real? Is there a soul on the other side? Can I apply this anywhere? So our approach so we teach with TV show and movie clips. The very first lesson, we learn konnichiwa, and it's a clip of somebody saying konnichiwa in a TV show or a movie. So it's real pronunciation. You can see real faces or anime faces. And some of the examples that we give you are in sentences. So you always know the contextual situation when you should use this. So it's like learning a language isn't a math problem. It's more like archaeology. Like there's culture behind it. You're digging up this piece. You're figuring out the history of this word and why they say things this way, you know? And so like if you don't have that culture and you don't have the humanity next to it, you're losing a lot of the information around it. It becomes lost in translation, you know? So
in what way are you really let's say, for example, if I want to use your app and I want to learn how to get fluent in Chinese, or let's say even in German, like are you looking to integrate more languages on it, or is it just going to be strictly focused on the on Chinese and Japanese?
So right now it's Japanese and English actually. We haven't actually done Chinese yet, but Spanish is launching next week, and we're going to do German and French next. Basically just walk down the most studied languages in the world. Chinese will eventually get there. So yeah, you could start our app at 0, and the approach is a vocabulary-based approach at the moment, which is here's a vocabulary word, here's how that vocabulary word is used in real life, and then here's some quizzes to reinforce that meaning. Then that word plus clips, that contextual clips, get put into a review system to where a lot of learning is remembering, right? So there's memory system.
How do you So like I said, because a lot of people, there's been a lot of language learning apps all over, and then people and the thing is that the world has not become fluent in another language even after so many different iterations of language learning apps out there. So how is it that your app will be the one making that change and making that impact?
That's a good point. There's so many language learning apps out there, and I think that the key difference and the key insight about what we're doing versus everyone else is the materials that we introduce you to, period. The main reason why people aren't able to use a language is because they're not the type of, we call it input in the industry, basically the type of materials you're exposed to. Your exposure to the language is not the real language. So we're giving you native exposure to the language during the process.
Basically like slang, right? You can put slang on it much more. Right. You can teach slang much faster than just proper way of speaking.
Yeah, so even proper way of speaking, if you hear a robot voice versus you hear a real person say it, there's still nuances. You need to train your ears still. And that trains pronunciation, it trains understanding. Also, if you hear, if you're learning a word and in school, it's put in this very strict structure, you're not always going to hear it in that structure. There might be a pause. They might have said it and cut off the end of the word. They might the way they actually say it is what we want to approach, and then expose people to. And then of course the slang, right? For example, yo, hi, not just hello, right?
Yeah.
Things like this are things that will attach to lessons as well. If I teach you hello, I also teach you hi, I teach you yo, these kind of extra add-ons. More exposure.
The funny thing is that, what you're teaching them is how the typical way, let's say for example, for someone who's learning English, they'll be learning more about the current way of speaking compared to the classical way of speaking English, if you know, or the proper way of speaking English.
Right.
So do you feel like the future, let's just say if a lot of people around in another country use this app to learn English, do you think they'll be more exposed to a more slang way of speaking rather than just a regular way of speaking in general? Because sometimes that could be going to, that could, see, the way, the way we speak English is not the same way as how the British or the Australians or the Canadians speak English. I mean, even though we have the same accent as the Canadians, somewhat similar, but when we utilize certain words or how we spell certain words, maneuvering, we're maneuvering in the British way of saying it. So do you think, because there's always those issues where, if you just put the American way of teaching English on that app, and then, when they start, sounding like something different to another person, like how do they understand that's English or not?
So there's a lot of questions here, and let me try to tackle a couple of them that I remember. So the first is, actually, it's not just about slang. And the long-term goal of this is, it depends on the goal of the user. Because it's native materials only, it might be very formal language. For example, we could cut out of a show that's from a newsroom, right? And they, or from a government, type of political show. And the type of language that they'll learn in that show or movie is going to be very different than if it's like 8 Mile, right? And so the long-term goal is it's up to the user to determine what their main language learning goals are. And then we can show them native materials in order to understand how the language is really used. And so it's not slang versus traditional way of speaking. It's just native way of speaking, which is different than teacher written speech. Right. So the second,
maybe like our traditional written speech, like way of.
So traditional written type speech, like formal writing, I think to get formal written like education, you need to read. So I do have to say there is like a limit on video. You still need to best way to learn a language is to read and to watch media and talk to people, right? Like you need to do all of these things. If you don't read, then obviously your formal understanding of things could be a lot different. Like if you read a newspaper, you read books, even in English, it improves your vocabulary in a different way. Like you get different type of knowledge that way. So I would always suggest that people should also read in order to get a more enriched vocabulary.
Yeah, because an interesting fact is that I have friends from China who say that they know how to read English better than they can speak English.
That's so true. And they call it 哑巴英语, which is like mute English. They have a word for it, like where they can't speak. Is because they don't, and actually they don't do a lot of listening practice. And speaking starts with listening, actually. If your ear can understand the sounds, you're more likely to be able to form them. Although you do need to practice because there is a mechanical mechanism behind your tongue and mouth being able to form the sounds properly. But if you can't hear your own mistakes, it's hard for you to pronounce things. So it all starts with the ear when it comes to speaking and like conversation. So you need to watch a lot of TV shows with no subtitles, or you need to consume a lot of like multimedia, like video and audio in order to understand and really internalize the way that the language is supposed to sound, right? So that's what but that's not always the case. It depends on the country and culture and how they teach and how people tend to learn languages. You might see that Americans tend to read a little bit less, but they speak a lot more. We're a little bit more extroverted than Chinese are when it comes to these kind of situations. But you're really quick to address your other point about accents. Yeah. So right now we're not selecting based on accent for content because we have limited content at the moment. We need to add more content to our platform. But eventually you'll be able to select content from a region if you wanted to. Like we know that there's different accents. So you could say, I want to learn British English or I want to learn American English, or we could just do mixed mode to where we kind of mix in both, to your study materials.
And so what do you see, where do you see this venture going in the next couple of years, especially with, you're trying to see how you can distinguish yourself or like carve yourself out from the Duolingo way of creating language learning apps, or even Italki or any other kind of way of the way it's structured? Like how... Yours is you're carving out a niche away from those types of language learning apps, right?
Yeah, I would say that the hope is rather than a niche, it's a revolution. So, I mean, Duolingo and a lot of these other language learning apps were conceptualized 10 years ago. There wasn't, YouTube wasn't even very popular yet. Now Netflix didn't have international shows, globalization in terms of multimedia and little Hollywoods all over the world wasn't really a thing when Duolingo first started. So the idea that you can learn in this way is kind of a new thing. And So anyway, our idea is that rather than just a niche for people that want to expose themselves to native content, is that we do believe that this will be the best way of learning the language, and it's more fun. You get the reward of being able to use the language from day one, as opposed to having this delayed cycle of use it for 2 years and then you can use it, or learn for 2 years, then you can use it.
All right. Sounds good. So what is your overall like, what is your 5-year plan with this thing? Well, what is that?
Long-term mission. Yeah, man, I wish startups could plan like really concretely, but the way I see this going is to where we can personalize your learning journey for what your goals are. And we've been able to miniaturize and kind of take clips from the real world in a way that's very, very easy and comprehensible for people to understand, where we can build what we call the comprehensive step ladder. This is going to take us a while to do, to where you could just watch clip after clip and you'll be able to naturally understand it. Like, as we build upon your listening skills and your vocabulary skills. But like, where this really goes is 10 times the speed to fluency, basically. 2 years of Duolingo gets you to high beginner. 2 years of our app should get you to fluency. Is kind of like the end goal. And what that probably adds some kind of pronunciation practice and other things.
Do you think you'll be adding more conversational related features in the app?
Yeah, I think the first one that we've definitely considered is pronunciation practice for sure. The next is once you get to a certain level, you've got a certain level of vocabulary, we definitely want to add conversation partners in the app. If you have enough users in your app, you can create conversation rooms. You can create conversation games.
So it's kind of like Clubhouse or like Zoom breakout rooms or something where you have these people who want to converse with you. You can have breakout room sessions and start speaking with them in their language. And yeah,
that is definitely, I think it's absolutely necessary. And there's no really great place to do this, to actually practice real conversation with real people. Our app, it's all about like real people and real things behind it. So if we do get to when we do get to the point where we add this and we have enough users on the platform, so there's always somebody there to talk to,
it's kind of like,
definitely want to add that.
It's going to be more like the Clubhouse, just meant for people who want to practice a foreign language.
Right. We have some ideas behind how it would look, because there are real life examples. You can go in Los Angeles to a language exchange meetup, all the time, and you can practice your language, but it's so far away.
It's not just that, it's also, I just don't like to plan, when you're speaking a language, you don't want to plan it. That's my issue that's my problem sometimes when trying to speak a language, is that I try to plan it, and that causes me to really go into a very stiff mode in the way I speak. So it's like you don't really get spontaneous conversations when you have to schedule a meetup. It's like someone has to just it's more like that. There's a reason why immersion is better when you're in the other country than when you're in your home country. Because you're kind of like forced into that situation of immersion rather than rather than scheduling a time where you can just go to the cafe and hey, let's start speaking in Chinese or something like that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't think we can completely replicate like spontaneous immersion, or maybe there is a way. Maybe somebody comes up with it. I don't have any ideas at the moment, but I had to spend a lot of time trying to figure out the social element to it. Because the first element I want to solve is, can I actually learn the basics of the language through real media, which is the most effective way to do it. But I think it's a great point. Like, is there a way to take that experience of running into people and talking to people in unexpected ways to where you could practice? Like, I really hope so. At a minimum, I think that there's a more convenient language exchange modal that could be in an app. But it first requires a large user base of people. So you've got these, everyone online at the same time, like a Clubhouse or something, to where there's rooms and you just jump in, talk, or jump out. Jump into that room, talk, and jump out. Maybe that's enough. It's possible.
All right, cool. And so I'm just going to wrap up this this amazing conversation and ask this one final question, which is, you've been in this startup world for many years now. You've experienced somewhat success and loads of failure. What advice, and also now you're working on your fourth venture, so what advice would you give to aspiring founders or anyone, or visionaries, or people who have strong missions, what they should do, let's just say when they deal with a lot of failures and setbacks?
I think you have to frame the failures correctly, because I wouldn't actually say necessarily that I've had any failures. It's just that I've made mistakes and I've learned from them. I think failure is just when you don't learn and you give up, and I see that a lot. I think in this space, being resilient tends to be the answer, and people who really care a lot about their mission and care about people tend to be more successful, I think. So But I think it's going to take a lot longer than you ever expect because there's so much to learn, right? So if you have a failure, if you can look at it like, what can I learn from this so I could be better tomorrow? I definitely didn't always do that. Like, because the part of this journey is becoming a better person yourself. There's personal development along the journey. You have to be okay with mistakes. I've gotten much better at being okay with mistakes and okay with customers yelling at me and terrible reviews and all of that, and going, what does this mean, and how can I improve my business? How can I add more value? I would say that the top thing is just being okay with slipping and falling, and being able to view those experiences as, being able to get back up and learn from them. And the other thing I wish I did a lot more when I was younger is reach out to other people who have been through the journey and ask for more advice, especially as I was taking the journey and as I was slipping and falling, rather than hiding those mistakes and being prideful, being like, hey, I made this mistake. Can you help me understand what I should have done better? Having like a network of people can definitely speed up that learning a lot.
All right, cool, Jason. Thank you so much for coming on the Next in Time podcast, and looking forward to seeing how Umi can make a massive change in the language learning world.
Hey, thanks for having me. Really enjoyed it.